So thank you very much again for the generosity and the time and the effort you made to this interview. I'm honored to talk to you. And then, yeah, so a brief introductory note about you. I have some lines here that, yes. Some key phrases of Judith Butler have become linguistic staples. Take, for example, gender performativity. She's best known for her work in gender theory, especially her book, Gender Trouble, published almost 30 years ago. Judith Butler is the Maxine Elliott Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley, where she has taught since 1993. But today we are going to talk about violence and nonviolence, as published in a slim book, The Force of Nonviolence, a very brilliant, insightful book that I really enjoyed. So the first question is, you offer an outsized argument in the book. Our times need a new imagination of human beings living together based on radical equality. Do you think our age is an exception in that regard? Is this imagination eroded, or is equality more seriously at risk?
Well, first of all, thank you, Madi, for conducting this interview with me. I'm very honored to be in conversation with you.
My pleasure.
And thank you for reading my book and for your excellent first question. Yes, I do think that that during these times, and I consider these times to be pandemic times, to be times of climate change, to be times of increasing inequality, increasing precarity throughout the world. It is extremely important that we move beyond a narrow individualist idea of the self to understand that who we are is our relations to one another. I think that's perhaps an odd way to speak, but the relations we have to one another are our very identity, which means that we are social. We're social creatures. And we are interdependent, and that when we do harm to others, we also do harm to the bond that exists between us. So, in short, I think that we are seeing, especially under pandemic conditions, certain countries have access to vaccines, have access to advanced medical facilities, and other countries and regions have been abandoned and are at much greater risk of serious illness and death. So we see as well that certain companies are profiting during the pandemic, extraordinary profits, profits that exceed the budget of entire countries, and others are left in destitution. So we have to take into account this radical inequality and struggle against it. And that means not only developing a common critique of capitalism, but I would say developing a commitment to radical social equality. No one in this world should be without the medications that are appropriate to keep us alive. And that should be a much firmer commitment, a commitment to healthcare globally, a commitment to shelter, to food globally. And for me, this commitment follows from the fact that we are at risk. The Earth is at risk. Whole human populations are at risk. And we cannot subscribe any longer to views of the self that give priority to self-interest or to profit, nor can we draw boundaries around ourselves, our communities, our nations, thinking that what happens to others is of no concern to us.
Right. Thank you very much. Yet it seems that I mean, it's my formulation. It seems that there is an inverse correlation between imagination, as you presented in the book, and violence. And I guess one of the reasons such an inspirational and insightful book, as you also say in the book, can be called unrealistic or counter-realistic or utopian, is that imagination has been problematic.
Well, I think that the book makes a distinction between fantasy and imagination. And one form of social fantasy that concerns me is the fantasy of racial minorities that that white people can have, that we see operative, for instance, in police violence against migrants or police violence against Black and Brown communities here in the United States, but also clearly throughout Europe. We see the intense xenophobia in a place like Germany, and fear of the migrant from North Africa or from the Middle East in a place like Germany. I think that these kinds of fantasies can involve imagining that these others who are not like us are out to destroy us, and that the entrance of those groups into our country will destroy our national identity, will undermine our capacity to survive as a people. And that kind of thinking very often fuels violence. So for instance, when police in the United States defend their violence against Black men, they claim that they are defending themselves, even if the Black man in question is on the ground or shackled or restrained in an obvious way. So we have to ask, what is the fantasy of being threatened by someone who is what we might say a racialized other? How does that work in amplifying police power and also justifying police violence? So I'm interested in how violent fantasy or fantasies of destruction sometimes operate in our justifications of violence, right? They allow us to do violence. Right. But I'm also interested in forms of imagining a world. And maybe it also draws on what we would psychoanalytically call fantasy, but it also is a way of imagining beyond those dynamics. What would radical racial, gender cohabitation look like? What would it look like to have truly multilingual, international lives where we not only accept certain kinds of cultural differences, but affirm them and welcome them? I just think we have to move beyond the fantasies of destruction that justify state violence in particular, but also non-state violence, toward an imagining of cohabitation in which we understand our interdependency and our equality. And interdependency is made clear by the pandemic. Interdependency is made clear by climate change. It is this earth, this common earth, on which we all depend. And we depend on each other to preserve this earth in order for life to be possible. There's no individual solution to climate change. There's actually no national solution.
Right. So in the force of nonviolence, you challenge a dominant individualist paradigm in which violence and nonviolence have been understood, and you call for a new interpretation of violence together with that imagination, as you said, of nonviolence as a collective form of political action. Individuality seems to be a recurrent theme in your writings, as for instance, in the article you published in April 2021, where you say creating an inhabitable world for humans means dismantling rigid forms of individuality. What is exactly wrong with this individuality?
Well, look, I like being an individual, and you know, it would be upsetting to me if there was somebody else who was exactly like me. So it's not as if I disdain individuality, but as we start to think about our world, if we start just from the point of view of this first person, this I, then we imagine that we are bounded, specific individuals who approach this world and others as something outside of ourselves. But what if this world, this earth, and the world of others is also internal to who we are? That is to say, we take them in, we take in the earth, we ingest, we digest from the earth foods that we need. We take in others and what they say to us, what they give to us, how they care for us, and that becomes part of who we are. We're dependent on health systems, and the very health of my bones, the very health of my blood depends on a health system that can sustain me. So I depend on those institutions, but in some sense, they're also part of who I am. So that's what I would call a relational understanding of selfhood. There is still this self here, but who would I be without these others, these institutions, this earth? I would not be. My very life depends on those relationships on which I am dependent and which in turn constitute me.
As you rightly said, I mean, just right now, you said the pandemic has illuminated and intensified racial and economic inequalities at the same time that it heightened the global sense of our obligations to one another and the earth. We witness how many groups of people around the globe are not treated equally in the face of such immunological predicament. What bothers is, again, the pandemic cannot be thought about without facing those inequalities. But some people do, most people do. In most cases, a nationalistic or localized discourse, if not individualistic one, prevails. I'm saving myself and that's enough. What is interdependence? Why is interdependence such a hard thing? Normally, among psychologists, it's coming to talk of different forms of empathy, for example, affective empathy and critical empathy. You talk in parts of the book about substitutability, the idea that one person can be substituted for another, and that this happens quite often in psychic life. So what's the problem? Why people have I mean, is it a question of sympathy? Should we boost our sympathy in this form of substitution?
Well, here again, of course, I appreciate it when people are sympathetic, and I seek to be sympathetic. I appreciate it when there is empathy and people give due consideration to someone else's situation, their pain, even their joy. So I value those characteristics. We might understand them as moral dispositions that are valuable. But I don't think that either sympathy or empathy go far enough in describing our social lives. If I empathize with somebody, then I feel what they feel, which assumes that I have already the experience that they are going through, and that their experience is modeled on mine. Well, that can be a very selfish way of approaching another. It can be a way of assuming that what you're going through is what I went through. Nothing new over there. There's nothing you're going through that makes me have to adjust my understanding of what can be experienced by humans. But what if the limits of what I think I know are challenged by what you tell me about your situation? Then I must revise my understanding of who I am and who you are and what it is to be in relation to others. So I worry sometimes that sympathy and empathy in particular assume sameness when actually we need to be attuned ethically to the alterity, the difference that some other person might bring or some other group might bring to the situation. Especially if I come from the first world or from the United States and I think, oh, I've had all the experiences that help me to sympathize with everyone in the world. It's like, no, you do not. You do not. And yet it is part of a kind of moral imperialism to say anything that anyone experiences, I can experience and understand by virtue of our human commonality. Well, maybe in time, but there's some translation, there's some epistemic disturbance, there's some transformation that has to happen to be ethically responsive to people who live in very different circumstances. So that's a struggle. It's not a simple moral disposition. It's an active struggle, and it involves translation, not just linguistically, but sometimes between emotional and epistemic worlds.
So you mean if sympathy and empathy might lead in sameness, substitutability does not necessarily lead in sameness?
I think substitutability is a more formal concept, and it imposes a certain kind of burden on us to think about ourselves as and how we treat people as universalizable. Like, can I generalize or universalize my policy, my behavior, my practice, my principles? There's one way of universalizing, which I believe is imperial, like I will project them onto you and you will reflect them back to me and I will be self-sufficient. It's another to realize that what happens to you can happen to me, that I am not invulnerable while you are vulnerable. You suffer, but I don't suffer. From the position of non-suffering, I feel for you. No, I can suffer too. I can die from this illness. I can also be subject to natural disaster. I can lose whatever wealth I have, depending on the institutions, financial and otherwise, on which I depend. In other words, I think substitutability can check or limit our paternalism, our imperialism, and it keeps us from imagining that only some groups of people are vulnerable and others are not. That's not true. We're all potentially vulnerable. I mean, it might be socially, yes, but that does not mean fundamentally each of us could not be in some situation of destitution.
Right.
And illness, cancer tells us that. The pandemic tells us that.
Which necessitates probably that kind of radical imagination that you talk about.
Yes, I think so. If we go back to nonviolence, I mean, many people say, oh, I'm not interested in nonviolence because I believe in self-defense. I would fight to defend myself, or I would fight to defend my child, or my dog. Dogs appear often in the examples I've given. So I don't have a prohibition on acting violently. I don't generally act violently, but there are some exceptions to what I do. But then if I push the question a little more, so you would act violently for your dog and your cousin and your child. What about your second cousin? What about your third cousin? What about the neighbor? What about the person you don't know? And then, of course, people draw a line, and it turns out that what they're actually saying is that they would act violently on behalf of those who are close to them, but the rest of the people, they're not so interested in protecting those lives. Now, I'm not arguing, oh, they shouldn't actively defend people close to them, but I see that they do draw a line between people whose lives are worth fighting for and others whose lives are not worth fighting for, which means that the self that they're defending is limited to this community, to this household, to this religion, or even nationality or race. And at that point, we start making distinctions between more valuable and less valuable lives. And that's a mistake. That's a mistake, which is why the exception, the approach to self-defense that makes exceptions is also an approach that decides on lives that are more valuable and lives that are less valuable. I think we cannot start there.
Right.
I think we have to start with imagining the radical equality of all lives and then ask the question, violence, no violence. What does violence do to our imagining, our commitment to the radical equality of all lives?
Right. Yeah. Which probably brings us to the question of grievability. But the thing is that when we talk about Judith Butler, there are usually two issues which spring to mind: Palestine and gender. I think this book addresses both issues, violence in its different forms. Yet, do you think that there is a deep relevance between different forms of violence? My example is Iran. I hope I'm not being too local, but the country under sanctions, US sanctions against Iran, international sanctions against Iran, include an embargo on dealings with the countries by the US and a ban on selling aircraft and repair parts to Iranian aviation companies, for example. Yet, as a result of this international violence against Iran, in many cases, has justified the way the Iranian regime has condemned and imprisoned or sentenced to death its opposition, as if there is, as you put it, a contagious sense of uninhibited satisfaction of sadism.
Yes. Sorry, yes. Yes, well, I think it's true. US foreign policy, I think, has sadism running through it everywhere. We saw in the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan that certain lives were protected. They could get on planes and other lives were abandoned. And the US knew very well that those who had supported them, offered translation services, provided social services, that those people would be subject to imprisonment or death, and they abandoned them to imprisonment and death. So the very nationalism that got us into that particular occupation is also the nationalism that we asserted again in the withdrawal, making a policy decision about lives that were worth saving and lives not worth saving. Iran, I think here again, we would have to go back to the idea of fantasy. What is Iran in the US imagination, and how is that linked to the US-Israeli alliance? And of course, you say Iran and people say, oh, destruction, they will destroy the state of Israel. They are building destructive weapons. The word destruction is so deeply linked in this political, social fantasy of Iran that the actual lives of the people, their institutions, their livelihoods, their economic capacities to live and to flourish are not considered at all. I think that what the Israeli government does in the name of self-defense obviously has played a role in my thinking about the limits of self-defense as an argument. The Israeli government can attack and does attack always in the name of self-defense. It bombards Gaza, it kills children in Gaza in the name of self-defense. When the Gazans put balloons in the air, the Israelis decide that's a threat on their lives, and then they bomb and they kill lives. So from the fantasy of this enormous destructive force that's coming, they justify their actually enormous destructive force. So we see how that works, and it's quite worrisome. I'm also aware in Iran about the prison system, and I've known people who've been detained for a very long period of time in the Evin prison in particular, who have been subject to interrogation and coercion in ways that I find extremely horrible. I think the history of Iran is not known as well as it should be in the United States. But I think we need to here substitute concrete social history for political fantasy.
One of the main themes in the book is grievability, that they really loved, and it is when the loss is not recognized and it's not marked, which means that it's treated as if it were no loss. What is it, if you could please elaborate it, and why is it so important to the relation of violence?
Well, you know, it's funny, I've been working on a Greek tragedy, The Eumenides, lately. And, you know, there's a famous trial in this play. Orestes is charged with having killed his mother. And Apollo says, well, actually, she's not your mother. She's just a nurse. She nursed the seed of your father. Your father's your only real parent. So she's not your mother, and she doesn't really count. So we can't really charge you with matricide because there is no such thing as the crime of matricide. Now, in that case, the existence of the mother is denied, and the killing of the mother is denied. And you can deny the killing of the mother by denying that there are mothers, that there is even a category of mothers. So that was an effort on the part of Apollo to make the death of Clytemnestra, Orestes' mother, ungrievable, right? She never existed, so you could not have killed her. She didn't exist as a mother, so there is no crime of matricide. But I think something like this happens a great deal in bombings, in the abandonment of migrant communities on the Mediterranean. They are not considered to be lives worth preserving. They are not lives, they're threats to Europe, or they are criminals. And these categories already deprive them of life. So when they do die, their boats collapse or they die in the water, it's not really the death of living creatures. It's just punishment for a criminal. It's just punishment for someone who is not regarded as truly human. And in that sense, there is no loss, there's no grief. But I do think under certain circumstances, whole groups, people can be regarded as ungrievable. That is to say, if they were lost, there would be no loss and there would be nothing to grieve. And it's that mindset, that way of thinking, which I believe takes hold not just in war, but also in public policies that subject people to abandonment and death. But also in the case of femicide, the killing of women throughout Latin America and other places, it's not grievable. Their lives are not grievable because their lives were from the start understood as dispensable.
Which are basically the main examples in the book. I mean, the movements in Latin America and also Black women, certainly, whose lives are not as grievable. I mean,
Yes.
even less than Black men.
Yes.
Yeah. When it comes to interdependence, one of the main issues it turns out to be is a fear to be ashamed, a fear of being humiliated, as if there is a feminization inherent in the concept of interdependence that opposes the institutionally individual self-interest. Do you think a part of our individuality is a direct result of a conscious or unconscious avoidance of femininity as it has historically been associated with vulnerability and weakness?
Yes. In short, yes. I think, look, sometimes feminists have done this, right? Feminists have said, we stand for care, we stand for dependency, we stand for vulnerability. Mm-hmm. We see the value of frailty or fragility, and we have a specific set of values as women that are distinct from the masculine world. So even feminists have gone in that direction. But my view is that that dependency and vulnerability define all of our social relations, that they are not gendered from the start. They are not the specific province of women or men. And yet, the social organization of vulnerability, identifies vulnerability with women. So externalizes it or assigns vulnerability to women. And produces an illusion that somehow true masculinity is liberated from vulnerability and dependency. But these are false ways of proceeding. They build in inequality, and they assign essential characteristics to women and men that I think are in no sense essential or to be taken for granted.
Let's go to Freud a bit. Through mania, we have a counter-realism, as you call it, in 3 different levels to oppose violence, or 3 limits towards radical non-violence: the imaginary limits of individualism, demographic limits that divide and rule the population based on racial and gender phantasms, and the structural construct that institutionalize these limits and accordingly legitimize their administrative violence. Between the libidinal energy of our ego and the exercising its violence on the one hand, and the violence of the superego to control the violence violently, there is another force, namely the force of mania. It allows us to imagine otherworldly possibilities. As you say it, mania asks, I'm quoting you, is there any way out of this vicious circle in which destructiveness is countered by self-destructiveness, end of quote. Can you elaborate, please, on the role of mania as an unrealistic form of insurrectionary solidarity that turns against authoritarian and tyrannical rule?
Yes.
Sorry, long question.
Yes, no, it's good. It's good. It's funny. I sometimes can't believe I wrote that. Like, do I mean that? Am I sure I mean that? Maybe it's helpful to remember that when Freud makes a distinction between mourning and melancholia, he makes a distinction between a loss that can be acknowledged or is acknowledged, and a loss that is not acknowledged or for which there is no language for acknowledgement, no media in which to acknowledge that loss. And I think that the situation of melancholia is then described both as self-reproach on the one hand, but also as mania. And the self-reproach in melancholia is interesting because it is, on the one hand, a way of keeping company with the other who is lost, becomes a kind of internalized superego who punishes me. But it's also a tyrannical structure that takes hold in the psyche. And Freud himself does draw an analogy between tyranny and the superego. So the intensification of the superego, the punishing force in psychic life, is also the structure of tyranny. So it's not just that we've internalized an external social political structure, our own psychic structure gives us a sense of what these political structures are. And he then identifies mania as a throwing off of the law, a throwing off of this punishing force, the overthrow of tyranny. It's an extremely interesting passage. And I think that it, on the one hand, it's part of melancholia, so it's still not acknowledging loss. But on the other hand, it's a way of saying, why do I have to live with these limits? Why do I have to accept these limits? Maybe I don't need to reconcile myself with the loss. Maybe I need to object to the loss of life, to the loss of life worlds. Maybe I can fight against future loss, the future loss of life. Maybe I don't need to have a realistic idea of loss. Maybe I can object to the fact that so many lives are being lost and they don't need to be lost. It's unnecessary. Maybe I can imagine a world in which we would all be grievable and there would be protections against unnecessary death, and that they would be widely and equally available. So mania does have mania refuses to accept reality. Mania refuses to accept the status quo. Many psychoanalysts say, oh, you cannot give any value to mania. People who are not accepting reality are in a distorted and pathological condition. But maybe a little pathology is good. Maybe we need to think about the realities we are willing to accept and the ones we are not.
But then the force of nonviolence, as it's written here, is it the force of mania?
No, I think what it is learning to live with a certain ambivalence. Maybe that's a different category than mania. Also, arguably, a psychoanalytic category. But if I want to kill, or if I'm part of a group that wants to kill or to seek revenge, but I decide against it because I don't want to live in a world in which more violence takes place. I don't want to live in a more violent world. Then I have a struggle. What do I do with my rage so that it does not convert into violence? And one reason I say in the book that nonviolence is not about being peaceful, it's not about feeling harmony inside. It can actually come out of utter rage, utter fury. And yet we can be enraged and furious without inflicting harm, without inflicting violence. So how do you live with that ambivalence? Wanting revenge, refusing to take revenge. And I think there's an ethics that belongs to that ambivalent situation. And we need to stay there because there are other ways of giving form to fury. Not just through art or writing, although those are wonderful, but also through repairing our relationships and repairing the earth. It may be that reparation is a way of practicing nonviolence that keeps us from making the world more violent.
I quote you. I have a a bit of a long question to bore you again. I quote you, if all lives are considered equally grievable, then a new form of equality is introduced into the understanding of social equality that bears on the governance of economic and institutional life, which would involve a wrestling with the destruction of which we ourselves are capable, a force against force. This would be different from protecting the vulnerable by strengthening forms of paternalistic power. After all, that strategy always arrives late and fails to address the differential production of vulnerability. Is what you're criticizing, at least partly, inherent in the liberal understanding or even writing history? Somewhere in her book, Essays on Non-Fascist Life, Natasha Lennart puts it this way, I'm quoting her, it's a great liberal tradition to stand on the wrong side of history until the history is comfortably in the past, end of quote. Can we say that some lives are grievable, some are ungrievable, and some are grievable only later when things are safe? I can be reminded of war in Yemen in future, Palestine, Ni una menos, no, not one less, or Sandra Bland or other Black women who had been unfairly killed, and they can be probably grievable sometimes in future.
Yes, that's true. I think that's a wonderful quote from Natasha Lennart, and I think that's probably right. Let me explain that no one is intrinsically ungrievable, right? Ungrievability is a social condition that comes to apply to certain people at a certain time. And for instance, in Palestine, we could say those who are bombed or killed or tortured in prison are considered ungrievable from the perspective of the Israeli military, but their families and their friends are grieving them, and so we have to actually have a screen that splits in many directions to see how a life that is so grievable in one context can be so utterly ungrievable in another. And that's part of the rage, right? That's part of the intifada. It's like, you do not consider us grievable. You consider us dispensable. And so the rage, the protest is an assertion of grievability, but one has to break through the grid, the block against grievability somehow, which is also why we need the media in our global world. The media, with all of its problems, we do need it in order to assert grievability across those lines that have prohibited grievability, which is why certain stories have to be told about lives that are considered not worth narrating, and in spite of that devaluation.
Two modes or process of decision-making for lives, as you put it, are suffering and biopolitics. The suffering makes die and lets live, whereas the biopolitics makes live and lets die. The right to life, according to Foucault, is more ambiguous because power manages populations and not distinct subjects, and as a result, lives can be abandoned or let to die without anyone assuming responsibility for the action. It somehow, indirectly, the other day reminded me of an interview in German television in 1969, I was not born yet, where Dorothea Sohle, German liberation theologian, who coined the term Christofascism, argues that in post-war Germany, finding the evil, das Böse, is much harder than in National Sozialismus, because in post-war Germany, the evil is so hidden in the system that it skips population's attention. If I'm in Iran, I can blame the authoritarian system as responsible for the violence imposed But here, sometimes in Germany, I have difficulty addressing violence simply because violence seems to be elusive or it is difficult to track down. So is it somehow related to this sovereign and biopolitical description that you're offering in the book?
Yes, I think so. Well, thank you. That's a very interesting and challenging question for me. I mean, if we talk about Germany for the moment, the shift from fascism to democracy allowed many Germans to locate evil in the past, and of course, the trials that brought Nazis to justice were also ways of extracting evil people or those who did evil deeds from the common world. But at the same time, of course, I was never sure whether the German people had worked through their anti-Semitism, or whether they thought about their anti-Semitism in relation to more contemporary forms of racism. So even as a student there in 1979 and 80.
In Freiburg, yeah, I think.
In Heidelberg.
Heidelberg, right. Yeah.
I certainly experienced anti-Semitism, but I also saw racism against many of the Gastarbeiter and the exiles from Pakistan. And it seemed to me that because fascism was in the past and they were living under what they called democracy, that it was very difficult to name and to struggle against forms of racism that I think have only intensified in recent years, especially against migrants from predominantly Muslim countries, or from North Africa, or from Palestine, for that matter. So that's like a larger question of whether and how Germans distinguish anti-Semitism from racism, or allow their support of Israel to be a sign that they are not anti-Semitic and therefore not racist.
Yeah, I think my somehow what you mentioned about your experience in Germany and your challenge to figure it out is also formulated in my next question somehow, which is again, sorry, is a bit long question. In their book Unfähigkeit zu trauen, inability to mourn, 1967, Alexander Michelich and Margarete Michelich claim that guilt can be projected. I exercise violence on another person, but in order to not internalize the guilt, I project it somewhere. In the case of Germany, everyone can project that guilt retrospectively to Hitler and his lieutenants and make them exclusively responsible. Michelich in their book point to a variety of mechanisms of defense against Nazi past, including a preoccupation with technical problems, or for instance, in absorption in administrative routine or other forms of functioning, which resulted in Wunderwirtschaft or miracle economy. They all work as defense mechanisms on the side of those exercising violence. With the loss of Hitler, Germans managed to avoid self-devaluation by breaking all effective bridges to the immediate past. On the one hand, there is a delayed commemoration of Jews, for example. I mean, what I see here, what I experience here, in its most harmless way, And on the other hand, there is no sense of politics beyond the borders, let alone what can happen in Palestine or in Iran or in Yemen. I just want to say that I think there is also an effective side to the question of violence. I mean, can I claim that we can imagine also this effective side that tries to project it or try to just deal with it only retrospectively. It was in the past. I mean, you're in Berlin, there are thousands of museums to celebrate and commemorate Jews, yeah? But I don't think it guarantees anything.
Yes. Well, I mean, obviously there are many people, including, on the left, who have given this a lot of thought and have worked to understand the origins and also the continuation of anti-Semitism and other forms of racism in Germany. So it's not everyone. And I've had good conversations with people there who are trying to struggle to understand things. At the same time, I'm aware that many Germans believe, because anti-Semitism is the most important racism in their mind, that if they support the state of Israel and they're vocal about it, and they refuse to accept any criticism of that state, that they will therefore have overcome anti-Semitism. Now, the Mitterlichs had an idea of working through Durcharbeiten, right, which is very difficult, right? I mean, to work through your racism, to work through your anti-Semitism, to work through your homophobia or your misogyny. This is not easy. This is coming to grips with your family, with what you've been taught, with what you feel, with your images, your unthought through responses. There's a huge affective struggle to come to terms with anti-Semitism and overcome it. But there is no immediate ticket. And I feel like some Germans thought like, oh, if I support the state of Israel, absolutely, and without criticism, I will show myself to be not anti-Semitic. And that shows me actually that there's an unworked through anti-Semitism.
Nicht durcharbeiten. Yeah.
I mean, if you try to short circuit the process of working through, then you keep the unworked out material. You keep that history in place. You do not break it up and bring it forward. I mean, it has to be the case that there are good and bad Israelis. There has to be the case that there are good and bad Palestinians, that these are complex people, that they have complex histories, that, there's a whole field of political positions that we have to think about, we have to judge, we need to accept, and we need to study. You can't just have whatever Israel does is good. Anyone who criticizes Israel is anti-Semitic. That is the moment of externalization of an unworked through anti-Semitism. For me, that accusation, oh, you're criticizing the state of Israel, you are anti-Semitic. That shows me that there's unworked through anti-Semitism in the very person who makes the accusation. So they have not read the Mitterlichs. They did not read it well. And Yemen, I mean, if you look at the extraordinary human catastrophe of Yemen, I mean, where are all these European countries and their great European values of human rights and care for the other? I mean, the abandonment of several North African countries at this time is really unbelievable. And that abandonment is not going out there and killing them, but it is a form of letting them die.
Sure.
And we could call it biopolitical death, or we could go with Ashima Bembe and say it is necropolitical. It is a way of death dealing without killing, but it is still violent.
Right. My last question. uh, uh, is so I've been working with refugees in Berlin like last 5-6 years. I mean, after my PhD, I started working with them, and it is a week ago I was browsing the book and my questions in the office, and I mean, it's like a personal experience. So I took an Afghan woman who was looking for a job and came to the office, and so I just left the book aside and approached her. But meanwhile, I was thinking, what if she asked me what I'm reading? One of the paradoxes, I mean, apropos this Afghan woman, and in relation to the concept of interdependency, one of the paradoxes that I'm facing almost every day in my job is the fact that most of the refugees that I'm working with don't feel belonged here in Germany, especially when it comes to Afghan women or Arab women, and the way they're torn between their familial norms and restrictions from their countries and the new cultural norms exposed or imposed to them in Germany in the form of integration. Yet when I talk to German friends about this lack of belonging among the refugees, they criticize the word belonging right away as a loaded word which restricts freedom and difference. It seems to me that all the integration politics here is nothing but a constant effort loaded either with a tacit European arrogance or an ignorant nationalistic and European nostalgia. Do you think we also need a new interpretation of belonging in order to understand interdependency better?
Yes. The short answer is yes. You know, if you say is the word Gehörigkeit.
Zugehörigkeit.
Yeah, okay.
Zugehörigkeit.
So yeah. I mean, for many, that's particularism, communitarianism. That means belonging to your little community and not belonging to the broader public or the nation as such. But what I think is happening is that the broader public is already complex. It's already multiracial. It's already multilingual. There have always been communities, and would they say it to the Jews? Would they say, "Oh, you shouldn't have your community. You shouldn't have your sense of belonging to your community"? No. That one, they can have their belonging because they also belong here, but they belong here in their belonging to their community, right? So somehow that exception is made, and in fact, the Jewish community has an important place in the national government, the government in Berlin. I've seen how that works. So what about the presumption of Christianity in this so-called secular idea of Germanness? And I mean, we have to look at that. There are already religious assumptions made about what the public sphere is. And even the recognition of Judaism is done from that presumptive place. So Islam, other religions are particularistic, but they do not define or give specific meaning to the public sphere. They are, that is the logic by which those groups are separated out. And then there's a second moment, right, in this, where the mainstream German perspective will say, those people isolate themselves. They refuse to assimilate. They stay in their communities. It's their fault. But they've also been pushed there. So it is another moment of what you've called externalization. And it is a vicious circle. But that is because there is a deep hostility to the idea of a multi-religious, multilingual, and multiracial Germany.
True.
A deep resistance.
Right. I have to formulate no more question, but just a comment that in a part in the book you talk about beautifully. You talk about this impasse in communication, which now, especially in regard to Iran, is concrete to me and to a lot of my friends. As you write about Benjamin and its concept of this sphere of understanding, Sphäre der Verständigung, I hope this interview with you can be counted as one of the moments of implementing this nonviolence, this understanding. And that's why I am deeply thankful to you for the time and effort you made.
Thank you, Mahdi. I think we are working towards that kind of Verständigung, and let us hope that the circle widens. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I don't know what time it is now there. It's like noon almost. Huh?
1 o'clock. Yeah.
Okay, so I hope you enjoy your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank
Take
you.
good care.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Lovely to meet
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Nice to meet you.